Cool. Just triple checking. Someone can just say hi in the chat. That will help us make sure. Did they from Australia? Can you guys hear us okay? Double check, make sure the microphone is fine. I think we should be fine. We'll jump into it. Thanks
Sure.
for everyone joining in remotely. We're streaming live from the last day of NeurIPS at the workshops here in San Diego.
Beautiful sunny San Diego.
So sunny, beautiful.
It's
Love
gorgeous.
California. So yeah, we wanted to have a little impromptu kind of session, get everyone up to speed with some of the conversations we've been having and what we've been seeing. I'll introduce myself quickly, maybe you can as well, and we'll just dive into it. So I'm Vincent Koch. I'm doing research engineering at Comet and also developer relations.
I'm Abby Morgan. I'm also at Opik, and I'm also on the developer relations team with Vincent. So very excited to be here at NeurIPS. It's my second time, um, and it definitely lived up to the expectations of the first one. But the themes I think are definitely evolving a lot very quickly since the last time I was here.
Yeah, so I might get started with like what I saw, and maybe you can kind of touch base on what you see differently from
Sure.
your last visit. I think the first poster session we went to in the big fall, I think the thing that jumped out at to me was two things. I think there was a big emphasis on reinforcement learning, RL, as being like a large percentage of the posters.
Sure.
And then we also had, I think, almost close to one third of posters were like multimodality,
Yep.
mostly around sort of image-based sort of use cases, but not just that. So it's kind of interesting to see a lot of kind of key focus into those two areas, which doesn't come to me as any surprise really. But how does that differ from what you saw last year, Abby?
Well, I was actually here 2 years ago, but
Okay.
so maybe that's part of why such a big difference because that's about a millennia in AI time. Um, but yeah, I've been noticing the same thing. Definitely a lot more RL than 2 years ago. If there was really much of a present RL presence at all 2 years ago. Also noticing, I think my one of my biggest takeaways from the conference has been this huge emphasis on LLM evaluation.
Mm,
I feel like it's something Vincent and I talk a lot about because we work for Opik, which focuses on that, obviously. But uh, this is probably the first time I've seen other people getting really excited and curious about evaluation, and I feel like that's probably an indicator of the space maturing a little bit. When these technologies come out, they're super exciting. Everyone wants to build something flashy, something cool, something fun, and that's totally natural. And I think it takes a little bit of time for that ex- initial excitement to wear off for folks to start to realize, okay, wait, how am I actually going to make this work in the real world? Um, and this might look really flashy and fun, but there's also a whole lot of things that can go wrong. So it's exciting to see that we're starting to reach that point, I think, where folks are starting to think about more of the robustness and the reliability and the productionizability, if that's a word, of their systems. And then even seeing LLM evaluations uh, become popular enough that even they are being broken down into their own subcategories. So we've seen uh, many sessions on specifically reasoning evaluations, specifically RAG or retrieval evaluations, which are obviously testing for different things, code evaluations, which are obviously separate because they're oftentimes verifiable, but not always. And then more just general agentic evaluations. So, um, yeah, that's been my main takeaway. I've seen some other topics that uh, I don't want to say surprised about, but excited to see us. I've noticed a lot of multimodality, like you already mentioned. Um, a lot more about diffusion models than I was necessarily expecting. I come from a little bit more of a computer vision background, so I'm excited to see that. I know text diffusion models haven't
Really taken off, have they?
fully taken off, but there's something there. They're not to the performance level of um, non-diffusion LLMs, but uh, they're definitely really exciting, especially with the implications of how they generate their tokens. Um,
Yeah, I know we kind of touched on like evals quite a bit at the start, and we are somewhat biased, obviously, kind of focusing on evals. But I still remember this one oral session, like was it yesterday or the day before? A gentleman from XAI, and it was like this one slide as soon as we walked in, and it was like better models equals better evals. It's
yep.
like we need a better way of measuring kind of a good signal to give to these machines. So in one case is we're making better RL reinforcement learning loops for these models, but that's only as good as the reward signal that's going to be fed into these. So we're kind of seeing the two bottlenecks kind of playing really hand in hand.
Hmm.
On the flip side, though, I'm also seeing, and you're also going to agree with this, we're seeing a lot of benchmarks and evaluations for the sake of creating a benchmark and an evaluation.
Sure.
It's like huge amounts of fragmentation. It's like I'm going to create yet another like highly specific benchmark, and I feel like it's kind of adding to confusion a little bit in a space that's already somewhat confusing. And it kind of creates this thing where you've got lots of labs competing, so it gives them more surface area to say, hey, I've hit these benchmarks and these benchmarks. Not to say that there's some sort of manipulation going on, but like it's confusing to say, okay, which one is accurate. And we'd probably both agree with this that a lot of these benchmarks do try their best to kind of create something quite generic and reproducible. But 9 times out of 10, in a real world sort of production environment, say at a bank or a government, something complex, it doesn't always translate very well.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm just kind of excited, but also disappointed to see yes, eval's taking off, but it's like we still haven't kind of cracked that very like the human in the loop buzzword in a way.
Oh yeah.
It's still very much like very highly specific evals that we're seeing come
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, and even though I'm seeing evaluation a lot more and hearing people talk about it, I definitely don't think it's a completely sort of understood problem in the industry. I mean, I certainly don't understand it completely myself, but I think while I'm very excited that folks are starting to ask questions around evaluations, whereas I didn't hear that so much previously. Um, I do still think some of the questions might not be the right questions that they're asking. For example, you know, what evaluations should I use for my agent? Makes the assumption that there there are evaluations that are good for all agents. And while there might be some generic ones to sort of give you a baseline read on something like fluency or something like that, um, that's never going to be the start and finish to how you evaluate your agentic systems because they're going to be so particular to your use case, and your evaluations along the same vein will also be so specific to your use case. So uh, definitely excited to hear people talking more about it, but I think we have a little bit of way to go in
Mm,
terms of people just understanding what's needed to really get to a robust evaluation space.
yeah, totally agree. Okay. We talked about evals, we talked about sort of computer vision, RL. I'll touch on sort of the buzz in the room. I think roughly somewhere between 13,000 to 17,000 people, the largest NeurIPS ever, insane amount of papers submitted. I think this space is 100% sort of like taken off with like a bit of a rocket ship, and it definitely feels like a Super Bowl, Comic Con size thing. And one thing that was really interesting for me was to actually see people here that are not academic more so than I have done at any other academic conference. So everything from venture capital to startups, trying to really get into that frontier space to see how they can sort of add value or even hire people to some extent as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think our perception of the conference has also been a little bit unique this year in a really fun way. Just for context, Comet Opik usually sponsors a booth at NeurIPS every year. We sponsor many booths across many different conferences, ICLR, CVPR, most of the major conferences. And historically, we've always done NeurIPS as well, but we tried a little bit of a different approach this year. Um, and instead of sort of formal booth, we opted for some more casual external events. And it gave us a space, I think, to really chat with researchers and engineers in a way that we don't get to at the booth. So I just want to make note of that too. I'm not sure if it's completely that things are different now. We're seeing in a different light because we're having natural
Actually having, I remember like some of the conversations I had earlier, that there were hard problems and me now was this sort of emergence I saw in a lot of my conversations around browser agent, computer use agents,
Yeah.
although I didn't see that translate in papers on the floor. So I think sometimes there's research that we see, but then also when you talk to people, what are they actively challenged on? What are they focusing on now? This was a really interesting space. I think the browser agent computer use space seems somewhat logical when you think about, again, when we go back to that hard enterprise problems. You've got old legacy systems. You know, we've seen MCP, we've seen ways sort of like to try and give agents tool use, but like I think some companies and labs are trying to get to this kind of frontier stage of like, what if the machine could use the entire computer?
Yeah.
You know, use old systems and portals and terminals on your behalf. And I think different labs are sort of taking a different approach. Some are going down the pure browser. I'm going to teach it like how to read the code, or using VLLMs or train specific tokenizers, whereas others are like, I'm going to focus on the computer one. But one thing that was kind of true amongst everyone I spoke to is that the more they work on this sort of computer use, or like these more complex abstractions of like agents, we're seeing like they make mistakes, but they make mistakes at different points every time you run them. So like even the mistakes that these models are making at like these kind of complex systems are not easily reproducible, which means that like we're not sure where it's kind of going wrong and what that sort of value add is going to be.
Sure, absolutely. Um, and that brings up, I mean, we've already sort of touched on this, but just how much we're seeing with multimodal models and just bringing vision and audio into the fold of LLMs. Definitely seeing a lot more of that, and obviously that relates to computer use and browser use because you have to, the model
See
has
the
to be able
machine,
to,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly, totally. Uh,
And then also, how do you evaluate that? Because evaluating vision models isn't, and audio is an entirely different game than LLMs, which already is not a completely solved problem. So
yeah, so I think we're kind of hitting this next wave of like, to build realistic agents in the hands of people, we kind of need to solve benchmarks and data sets more holistically. And we need to think of like agents as systems and like with its complex parts and look at how we kind of solve that. I know there was a talk from the team behind sort of Terminal Bench and Harbor. We're kind of solving it for like coding agents as like this really kind of complex thing. I know there's a few people here from ArcAGI as well. So we're seeing more sort of like these generic logic sort of complex tasks
yeah,
that are coming out. But I think the more we kind of create these tasks, these evals, we see that, you know, people hit them, they over-engineer the models and the solutions and the papers to kind of hit these benchmarks, but
yes,
then they don't always translate to real world
yes,
sort of outcomes.
yeah, and that's a great point. I think um, I've definitely heard some folks sort of aware of that, but I think it's really important to remember not to over-index on these benchmarks, and also that these benchmarks aren't perfect. They are a subset of data, after all, um, and sometimes the results you get on these benchmarks, like you said, don't necessarily translate to the real world, and that says something about the benchmark. So I think what we really need is a lot more benchmark data sets. And something I guess I would have imagined, but I didn't like concretely know until this conference is just how much science goes into creating a benchmark. Um, it makes sense, like theoretically, but just hearing some researchers talk about what goes into that process. It's understandable why there aren't more, but we definitely need them.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Let's switch it up a bit. I'm going to talk about what I found was super exciting. You probably know where I'm going to go with this. That was completely left of field, and then maybe I'll take your take on this. For me, I've been following a group called Earth Sciences Project. I might misremember the ESP. They're basically looking at like LLMs and AI in the form of like animal and human
Yes.
communication, which I think is like a completely fascinating space because it kind of takes us away from this like really simple idea of like just human text and LLMs and actually looking at like language and communication and training transformer-based models and embeddings and more complicated stuff. And this was their first ever in-person workshop, co-hosted at NeurIPS. And it was just fascinating to watch people kind of like look at like embedding models that look at like whale speech or ant colonies and how agents kind of perform communication similar to like animals. So I think that's a really, really exciting space, completely left the field for me, and possibly one to watch because maybe some advancements in like embeddings and understanding language may translate to better multimodality, better agents,
Sure.
better outcomes as well. So that's definitely one if you did get a chance to dig through some of the posters and papers for that. Some really cool stuff.
Yeah, and to that point about the multimodality becoming more and more popular for animal translation, as I think they called it non-human animal translation. Is that what they called it? I think
I
something
believe
like
so,
that.
yeah.
You need much more than just a language model because animal communication is very different than human communication, obviously. It often includes, uh, behavior analysis, body language. Um, as I learned yesterday, it's not always just about the sounds that are
Sounds,
made,
yeah.
but sometimes the interaction back and forth or the effect that certain sounds have, and the sequence of sounds, and there's a lot of complications there. So it's interesting to see.
Yeah, it kind of takes me back to some conversations I had with people, which is a kind of something that Jan McLuhan touched on quite heavily around like child development and like there's more to information than just
Oh yeah,
what your eyes see, but it's the environment around you.
sure.
And like even in human language, we have so much stuff around like just mannerisms and like just how
It's
my hair sits
true.
there, or like just
Yeah.
facial structures that a lot of that energy, a lot of that information is just missing in a lot of the multimodal and text-based work that we're seeing now.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we know that it's so important for a lot of animal communication, um, but we haven't really considered it for humans. So maybe that's the next frontier of LLMs for humans is incorporating other data types. And that reminds me of a really interesting conversation we had with a researcher studying how to use electric signals in the brain to, or basically how to decode electrical signals in the brain. And I think the long-term end goal is potentially to use that information to shape the advertisements we see, which has some crazy implications. But
Reminds me of Minority Report when he was
yeah,
walking down the road and then the ads changed
yeah, no,
based on
exactly.
like his mindset is that. But
Super cool.
it kind of touches on something that I've been talking about very recently, like where the machine is more intentful around like what your intent is at that given point in time, or another sort of term that's been flying around in the talks here today around sort of experience-led AI.
Yes.
This sort of idea that we're not starting with a prompt, we're not starting with lots of data and benchmarks and bashing our way through it, but actually building the agents and the systems to really think about kind of that end user's goal is as a starting point and kind of working backwards to try and help them solve that. And it also touched on another talk, and we'll find these papers and we'll link them at the bottom. So
Sure.
I don't have them off the top of my head, which was another keynote around homogeneity, around models, which essentially said Hive Mind was the paper. Essentially talks about that like majority of these models, the base of them is all entirely like 95% of it's all pretty much the same. That we kind of have this hive mind thing where it's just like just the same information but circulating slightly differently. So when we think about the future of foundation models, what are we doing that's very drastically different when it comes to the data sets and the architectures
Sure.
to try and create something completely different that can kind of help with some of those processes that we're talking about as well.
Sure, and that relates back to specifically evaluations, which we're obviously super interested in. Thinking about, for example, the first thing that comes to my mind is LLM juries. I know one of the major criticisms of LLM juries is that most major models are trained on very similar distributions of data. So even if you're using models from different families, because they're very similar distributions of data, you're still going to get very similar results. Then that kind of plays into the sort of hive mind concept. And then, if we're talking about how to evaluate the evaluators, when we use LLM as a judge to evaluate our LLMs, who's evaluating our LLM as a judge? And it just sort of becomes this never-ending problem of uh, models evaluating models that are trained on very similar distributions of data.
I mean, just taking back a step based on what you saw, what would you do differently? Like, what would be something that you would think is like an interesting way? Like, for example, I spoke to the workshops today on evaluation. For example, met the Upwork team that have basically asked people that work on real world problems on their platform to create like a rubric
Mm-hmm.
of like how they would score that task that they worked on, and kind of creating something a little bit more complex than just like this binary. Obviously, there's multiple questions and
Sure.
something, so creating some more depth and something that you can kind of create more complex judges with. Do you think that's going to solve this, or like what do you think could be some? What's the next unlock for us to kind of take judges past that point from some of the challenges that we're facing?
That might be an improvement on current systems, but I have a lot of skepticism with that because um, it's still a binary sort of uh, like grading system that encodes specific. I'm trying to think of how to word
Are
this.
we compressing too much of the information?
Uh, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think for me, one of the reasons that, for example, embeddings can be so helpful is because they contain so much information that isn't necessarily um, like directly linkable to concepts that are representable in human language, right? There's so much underlying data that isn't necessarily feature A equals embedding A, right? It's much more complicated than that, and I think that's where the power of LLMs comes in. So I think similarly in evaluations, if we're just taking a rubric uh,
To a judge.
to a judge, we're still not giving it that sort of freedom to use that that information.
Yeah, and then like going back to like earlier language models, BERT score was obviously a big sort of
Hmm.
shift in sort of using embedding space as a way of saying does A look similar to B. I haven't really seen anything quite different using sort of transform architecture very recently.
Yeah,
I think we're kind of potentially over relying on judges. Not to say that that's a bad thing, but it's like how do you ground that? How do you validate that with sort of human data, which we haven't really seen much of in this
yeah, and I
space.
mean, there's a lot of great things about LLMs as judges. They're very scalable. They can quantify uh, things that just really aren't quantifiable in heuristic metrics. But they're very incomplete without heuristic metrics as well. And I'm going to sound like a broken record here because I feel like I say this all the time, but you just you really need a wide range of evaluation metrics of all types, heuristic, as a judge, um, and everything in between. Uh, um,
Because it's
like
not just cost, it's not just accuracy, right? I think a lot of people kind of fixate on accuracy, but huge amount of accuracy, massive models comes at a cost, right? I don't have the luxury to sit there and run a really complicated task for 5 minutes just to get
yeah,
one answer to hope it's like the perfect answer. So I think we need to kind of find smarter ways to get shortcuts.
sure. And I think this just comes back to the philosophical question of what is good. When you're evaluating, you're trying to evaluate a good versus a bad model. Um, what is good for my application might be not good for another application, obviously, but even more specifically than that, um, good can't be measured. So every evaluation we create is going to be some sort of proxy for good. So how are you building those proxies um, in a way that faithfully represents what your image of good is? And then, even a step farther back than that is you have to figure out what your good looks like. What is it you're trying to build? And I think through the development process, folks probably get a lot of new information that helps inform them what it is they're even trying to build. So that can be a moving target as well.
Did you see anything that was like, wow, that was threw me off?
In terms of,
Anything like valuations or otherwise today and this week in the conference?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I saw tons of stuff. I think probably the most fun one was the animal one that we saw. I really liked that. Um, and
There was another fun one. There's a separate sort of not a workshop, but like creative use cases where people they call them passion projects. I haven't had a chance to dig through it, but there's videos and you can go online and play it. We'll share the link where you train a Tamagotchi.
mm,
And the idea is to kind of like bring an agent to life and train it and heal it, and your Tamagotchi goes out to the real world. I think there's something to be said around like kind of how can we simulate large scale conversations, and I think this kind of goes into this whole world model thing. Can't remember the lady's name from Amazon that ran the workshop on using chess as a build a world model for chess and training an
yeah,
LLM to build
Emily Becker.
world models. And I think one thing that I took out of that conversation we had with the team there was that I think my understanding of what a world model is very different from what I thought it was.
Yeah,
I think that's one thing I took away from this session because it's not a space that I deal with a lot. I think when I think world model, I think this one model that answers everything with the whole entire world and all the little particles inside of it and the weather and all of that. But actually, it's more of a something that represents every possible action that could happen within a given problem space.
yep,
So in the game of chess, it's like how do we create a model that has every possible move and outcome of chess and an engine where a machine can go and play chess basically. So once I started thinking about that, I was like actually I think world models are potentially more feasible than we'd imagined. It's not about creating this like full universe, so to
sure.
speak, and maybe we're going to start to see benchmarks which kind of create those.
So are you envisioning more like, I guess maybe is the word world model a little misleading because it's sort of like a microcosm
Yeah.
of a world? Um,
Yeah, so if we look at, for example, terminal bench is one I'm going to go back to again, where it kind of they've created these tasks similar to ArcAGI, where they're like really complex sort of use cases for coding agents. It's kind of like a good step in the right direction because it's like a more complex sort of benchmark. But what happens when there's a model which represents the coding agents and the environment of like Python or something like that whole possibility space
yeah,
within it as a model that you can sort of tap into, and
sure.
then it kind of goes beyond the judge. Then it's like I'm going to observe and simulate what these LLMs are doing or what these agents are doing, and then seeing how that simulation goes rather than going, what do you think this is answer is right or wrong, right? So I think
Yeah,
that's quite interesting. So I originally had this idea that it's always going to be like a multimodal thing, 3D space. There's a whole world that's been modeled, but actually,
that
I don't
becomes
think it is.
really difficult to encompass
Yeah,
everything.
correct.
Yeah, um,
Cool.
that was very cool as well.
Any questions from any of our listeners online?
Or is there anyone online that's also here at NeurIPS? If there is, come by and say hi. We're on the upper deck outside in the back of the conference center.
Um, what else? I think I'll touch on some of the controversies this year. There's been a few with the review process, which I've been involved in at NeurIPS to some extent, and I think what we're seeing in academia in general is that AI generated slop is also affecting
Yeah,
academia. We're seeing a lot of papers written with just citations to like non-existent things. We're seeing a lot of papers being submitted in extreme volumes, some of which are sort of AI generated. And some conferences allow, some don't. But that's adding and exacerbating the volume, I suppose, of work that's coming through. And that's also creating challenges where now that we've got this sort of huge boom that's happening in this space and a lot of people wanting to support and add research and open source and all that, it's actually becoming too much noise as well because it's like lots of people talking now. It's impossible to pinpoint the one conversation or the few papers. Whereas when you went to some of the smaller conferences, like you can actually have a conversation in a room and really like solve
Sure.
challenging problems to a point where this is like almost becoming so large that it's like really hard to narrow down like what are the things that I'm going to focus on, who are the people that I connect with, and you kind of get lost in that sea a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that mirrors the more general just content issue that we have now that we have uh, just LLMs are so prevalent everywhere and so accessible and cheap. Um, there's just so much noise in content, whatever form it may take. Um, there's a lot of implications there, whether it be video, whether it be blogs, whether it be
Yeah, so we're feeling the content overload as well a little
yeah.
bit this year.
Do you
Um,
ever foresee using LLMs to on the other side of that to judge incoming work, or would that be? I mean, I can see problems there too.
yeah, it's an interesting one. There's actually a separate. I think there's a workshop here which is actually the use of AI in research itself,
Hmm.
and there is some work in that space as well. Like how do we judge human judges in a kind of in a funny way? So
Yeah.
the same eval process we've been talking about, but taking the human data. There's been a lot of work done uh, by various people that are here today in this conference of like taking all the review data out, analyzing it, the embedding space, and just trying to look at what good and bad looks like, look at the distribution. Obviously, everything is anonymous, which is kind of good and bad. It's bad because then you can't say reviewer A is this one on this paper, and then kind of build like a
Well, isn't
relationship.
that even a little bit
Touchy.
touchy right now?
Yeah.
Touchy is a good word. I don't know if you want to touch on
Yeah, so there
that. What
was a
happened?
recent, I think, leak of Open Review, which is the platform used for a lot of the AI-based sort of conferences. There was a bit of a security breach, and it's caused a lot of pandemonium. I think for iClear or ICML that's going through review at the moment. So people are like getting a bit panicky about like what does this mean for future papers and the review process.
Yeah.
I would say myself personally, having reviewed a large number of papers for this conference this year, there was a huge, what would I say, a huge dis- disparate sort of quality, not even in the papers, but just in the review process as well.
Mm,
I think because of the volume, even if you're trying to do the right thing, you may not have the time to go to every end
sure.
detail about that thing. But also because of the volume, we're seeing more sort of, I wouldn't say fringe, but variant, different types of ideas.
Hmm.
We've got more um, industry producing papers, like ourselves included, and submitting them. So we're getting some ideas that are a little bit more different than what maybe academia may have been used to. Obviously, going through the same research rigor, but as a reviewer, you're getting such a huge variety of things. Yes, it's in your field, it's within your realm of expertise, but you're seeing stuff that's like quite clumped together in some idea. You're seeing like a big spread
Sure.
of sort of concept.
Yeah, and I can imagine. I mean, from my past reviewing much simpler blog content, I could imagine from the reviewer's perspective, once you receive a certain amount of AI generated, clearly AI generated
Just
slop, it's a little exhausting to try to keep trying to give really good feedback, and that might make it more difficult for the rest of the researchers who are actually writing these articles because the reviewers are now exhausted from
correct. I
reading
think
so
that's where a
much
lot of
slop.
this frustration is coming
Yeah,
from. I feel like chicken and egg situation, but it's going to potentially hurt. Like there is some talk that maybe there's going to be fees attached to kind
sure.
of safeguard this process, but it, none of these are going to be the right answer. So we're starting to see this bottleneck
Hmm.
in the research community. I feel, and then it becomes a challenge of like, well, I can say I beat XYZ benchmark and score, and it's not peer reviewed and it's not verified. So who does the checking, right?
Yeah,
Like we need a way of like keeping all these checks and balances in place, especially when we're trying to put new models, new agents, and
Sure.
systems into production, right? We're thinking like robots, self-driving cars, healthcare scenarios, banks. These are critical systems that affect everyday people. We want to make sure it's kind of safe. Um, on that, have you heard anything around sort of AI safety on
Oh,
the on
that's
the
always
on
such a big topic.
the
I think uh, we were having a conversation about this the other
we
day.
were?
Um, so, on the one hand, I think, of course, AI safety is so important. On the other hand, there's a little bit of a hesitancy to even sort of open up that can of worms because it often feels like it gets so doomsday
Yeah,
so quickly.
I call it the Terminator idea.
And maybe that's fair, but it becomes a little bit more difficult to have a casual conversation about. And I think if we could, it would be a lot easier to talk about. Um, but at this conference, I'm trying to think of any papers or talks we've seen.
I think it was more around bias, right? It was more
We
around like,
saw a lot around bias.
yeah,
That's true.
so it's kind of alluding to that sort of safety side.
Yeah.
And then the other one I've noticed, which a lot of people in some of the frontier labs have somewhat confirmed for me, this concept around we're going to red team these models, as in
Yeah.
we're gonna try and break these models, and then what ends up happening is when they're trying to break something for whatever reason or brute force their way in, they actually end up finding an optimization, end up finding an edge because of its emergent behavior and how it behaves.
Yeah.
So then it kind of becomes this like similar to how you have in like pharmaceutical industry. You build a drug for one thing, you test it on a bunch of people, and you find it actually improves something else, and you're like, suddenly this drug is no longer about this; it's about this other thing.
Yeah.
So I think we're also seeing because of this safety aspect, so to speak, and people trying to break these models and find issues with them,
Yeah.
they're finding opportunities to like fix certain things with them, which then maybe improve accuracy or improve cost or make the models run faster or
Sure.
find some issues in that. So I think that's kind of adding to this sort of whole reinforcement learning
Yeah.
aspect a little bit.
And the more I think about it too, there's a lot that's very relevant to AI safety that we might not like traditionally classify as AI safety, but even evaluations are a huge part of AI. I mean, observability and evaluation are huge parts of AI safety because if you don't know what's going on in your LLM and your agent, then you certainly don't know if it's safe or not.
100%.
Um, and you need evaluations to determine that as well. Um, and then obviously things like guardrails. Uh, and stuff like that is super important. So those are all very relevant to what we do at Opik. But um, I know there's a really fantastic mech interp workshop today from Neil Nanda and team. So that's maybe not traditionally AI safety, but I think in a
It's kind of
way it is. Yeah, I mean anything that we can understand feels safer, right? It feels safer if we
yeah,
understand it.
let's get rid of the black box and
Yeah,
try to make it a bit more transparent.
yeah. So
Um, yeah, I think that's interesting. I think we've covered quite a fair bit. Anything else from
we have
anyone
any
else in mind? Any questions? Otherwise, we might slowly wrap this session up. We will do a number of paper readings over the next few sort of weeks as well for the holidays. I think there's a few coming up, right? That you
Yeah,
want to share.
shameless plug, December 17th, Claire Longo and I have a live paper reading on the Too Big to Think paper. You can find that on our archive. If you go to Comment Events on Luma, you can find a link to the event as well as a link to the paper and the original author. Um, very excited about that coming up. It's a great paper.
Cool. If there's no questions, I don't know it's a Sunday, Monday for those of you in the Asia Pacific region. But yeah, we'll share some of the links. We'll do a bit more of a blog post, something kind of wrapping up some of our thoughts around this. But yeah, we just wanted to kind of give you a sense check of some of the things that we're seeing on the floor around the conference. It is overwhelming, but there's a lot of exciting stuff in there as well. But yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.